All right, Broncos country, everybody come take a seat at the table. After the Denver Broncos lost on Christmas Eve night to the New England Patriots 26 to 23 to drop to 7 and 8, their playoff chances were basically thrown out the window. Although not mathematically eliminated, it's done. That they need a ton of help in order to make the playoffs. It's now time to have the Russell Wilson conversation. And this is a conversation that's likely happening right now at Dove Valley between George Paton, Sean Payton, and the Broncos brass. They've likely been having this conversation for weeks, quite frankly. Russell Wilson clearly is not the player that the Denver Broncos thought that they were getting when they traded all of the draft capital and players to the Seattle Seahawks. The thought process when the Broncos initially traded for Russell Wilson and then when the new ownership came in, they gave him that big contract. The thought was, all right, we're going to keep his salary cap hit manageable for the first couple of years and we're going to build the roster around him. We're just a quarterback and a couple of pieces away from contending with the Chiefs and being true Super Bowl contenders. We're going to use these 2 years as a window to do that. And then when Russell Wilson's money really starts to kick in, hopefully we will have already had a Super Bowl ring, much like what the Los Angeles Rams did in 2021 that resulted in them getting a chip after they went out and traded for Matthew Stafford. That is what George Paton was trying to do. It at first seemed like they were trying to do it with Aaron Rodgers. Unfortunately, the Packers got cold feet and weren't willing to ship Rodgers out the door. Rodgers wanted to come to Denver. He was committed to coming to Denver, much like he was committed in 2023 to go to the New York Jets. But the Packers got cold feet, and the Broncos were stuck because they had a coach in Nathaniel Hackett who was hired almost exclusively to woo Aaron Rodgers in. So they had to pivot to their plan B once it was clear that Rodgers wasn't leaving Green Bay, and that plan B was Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson was always the, call it plan 1B or just plan B. He was never the true plan 1A for the Denver Broncos that offseason. Aaron Rodgers was. That was very apparent with the hiring of Nathaniel Hackett. Again, when you're forced to pivot to your plan B like that, the thought process at the time was, okay, this is a pretty damn good plan B in Russell Wilson. He's a future Hall of Fame quarterback, 9-time Pro Bowler. It's kind of a shame that he never got an MVP vote for his time in Seattle because there was a time period from about 2015 to 2000 and really the first half of 2020 where Russell Wilson was a special player for the Seattle Seahawks. He carried that team through a period of transition from the Legion of Boom to really just Rust Ball, basically. And for a period of time there, it worked out pretty damn well for Seattle. I thought that a lot of their shortcomings came in lack of roster management and construction from Pete Carroll and John Schneider, their GM, as well as just overall poor coaching from Pete as well. Those were the main shortcomings from Seattle during those years. The narrative that Russell Wilson was always carried by good coaching in Seattle and was always carried by the Legion of Boom. I don't ever swear on this channel, or I try not to anyway, but that narrative was bullshit. Absolute bullshit. Russell Wilson was a very special player in his peak, a top 3 quarterback in the NFL. And even if the Broncos weren't going to get that, knowing they weren't going to get that heading into this trade, they thought that they were at least going to get probably a top 10 quarterback in Russell Wilson. Something changed in Russell Wilson that really caused a decline in his game in his last part in Seattle, as well as obviously his early years in Denver. One thing you can obviously attribute is just his overall aging. He loses his legs. He doesn't really have the same burst and explosiveness to run the football like he used to and be able to extend plays and get out of trouble in sacks. And that always made up for his deficiencies, not really being able to read the field clearly with his height, not being able to see over his offensive linemen, not being able to read the middle of the field. A lot of those deficiencies were able to be covered up. Another big issue for Russell Wilson in 2021, in week 6, I believe it was, on a Thursday night game against the Los Angeles Rams, Russell Wilson suffered a injury to the middle finger in his throwing hand. This injury, I feel like, has permanently kind of diminished Russell Wilson's downfield accuracy. He has never been the same in terms of accuracy downfield ever since that injury. And I even remember various YouTube doctors talking about how that was always a risk when Russell Wilson suffered this injury initially, because that finger is so critical in terms of generating spin and the right touch on the ball that you're trying to get. So that is really kind of the start of Russell Wilson's decline and why Seattle was so comfortable moving off from him. When he gets to Denver, he has to contend with just an overall disaster of a situation around him. Obviously, Nathaniel Hackett not being able to manage some of the deficiencies that Russell Wilson had, and then the overall just not being able to manage the locker room. Nathaniel Hackett was an incompetent coach who wasn't getting the quarterback that he was hired initially to work with. The Broncos could never outright come out and say it, but Nathaniel Hackett was hired to bring in Aaron Rodgers. I cannot stress that even more. If the Broncos had gotten their guy in Aaron Rodgers, we would have never been in this situation to begin with. We fast forward, obviously, to the 2023 offseason after Nathaniel Hackett's long gone. The Broncos need to get a head coach in here who can get the most out of Russell Wilson. And that head coach that they picked was Sean Payton. They were so confident in it, they traded away the first-round pick that they netted in the Bradley Chubb trade from the Miami Dolphins. That pick had changed hands quite a few times. It was initially the San Francisco 49ers first-round pick. So that pick ended up going to New Orleans Saints in exchange for Sean Payton, along with a second-round pick. And the Broncos trading for a head coach was a move that was pretty widely criticized at the time. But again, the thought process going into it was, hey, it's Sean Payton. He's a guy who pretty much single-handedly, along with Drew Brees, turned around that New Orleans Saints program. And you can also significantly make the argument that Sean Payton is the guy who really helped resurrect Drew Brees' career after he left the Chargers. Again, this whole narrative that Sean Payton was carried by Drew Brees, it's another one of those BS narratives, much like Russell Wilson was carried by Seattle. Guess what? It was a collaborative effort. All along, between all of those parties, it was a collaborative effort. So Sean Payton comes in here, and despite Russell Wilson's flaws, obviously we have the 1-5 start, but during that 1-5 start, Russell Wilson and the Broncos offense is actually playing some pretty good football. They're moving the ball well. Russell's making some really nice throws. Ironically enough, at the time, even though it was a 70-20 loss, I thought Russell Wilson's highest graded game on the season was the Miami Dolphins game. That Russell was playing some good ball during that time period, despite all the flaws in his game. Then, finally, defenses were starting to figure out some of the things that Russell was doing well, especially with some of the moon balls downfield, things like that. And that was getting taken away, and we saw Russell kind of have a bit of a diminish in performance, but right around that time is when the defense and the run game really started to rise, around the Green Bay game and the Kansas City game. And that's when the conversation started to pivot around, okay, maybe we can actually think about keeping Russell Wilson here in Denver throughout the long haul of this thing. Unfortunately, over the last couple of weeks, it's become apparent that this Broncos team is still quite a ways away from contending from a championship. And Russell Wilson, I feel like, is actually playing some decent ball right now. Even tonight against the New England Patriots, or I guess last night, it's 12:30 a.m. when I'm recording this on Christmas Day. But even then, I thought that Russell Wilson played pretty damn well. And in the Detroit game, despite the bad pass protection and the lack of run game, Russell Wilson played well in that game too, I thought. So Russell Wilson, I feel like, isn't the main issue in Denver right now, but his contract is going to become a big issue as we move into the future. I want to transition over here to overthecap.com right now. And what I want to do is showcase his salary. Russell Wilson, if he is on the roster the 5th day of the 2024 league year, which is in March, then his 2025 salary will become guaranteed. I was originally misconcepted in thinking it was going to be all of this $55 million, but actually it's just his $37 million base salary, which is still a significant amount of money that has the potential to hamstring the Broncos cap. So I feel like the Broncos have to take their exit avenue here and get out of Russell Wilson's contract before it becomes an issue. This is the one exit avenue they have to get off of this until the end of the 2025 season. And by that point, this roster could just be absolutely tanked with no capital to really fix it. And if we were to move on from Russell Wilson this offseason, what they would do is designate him as a post-June 1st cut. What the Broncos would do there is allow him to hit free agency in March. He'd still be off the roster by the 4th day of the league year, but it allows them to divide this cap hit into a couple of years. So essentially, in 2024, if they cut him with a post-June 1st release, they'd be eating a $35.4 million dead cap hit just right off the bat. Then, in 2025 and 2026, that hit would be split amongst those 2 years. It would normally be about a $37 million hit right there. You can split that into 2 years right there. So, essentially, it would be an $18 million cap hit in both of those years. But the Broncos would also save $37 million in 2025, as well as $40 million in 2026, and then 2027 and 2028, that's when the money isn't really too much of a factor. So this is the one avenue that you have to get out of Russell Wilson's deal before it really starts to hamstring the Broncos cap situation. And I want to make this clear, man. This is not coming from a position of wanting to get Russell out of town on a personal level. I like Russell Wilson a lot. I feel like he's done a lot of good things for this community ever since he's gotten here. He's genuinely a great dude, and I feel like Sean Payton's actually been able to get him to play some pretty decent football, but this contract is going to eventually become a huge albatross for the Broncos. They have one chance to get out of it. Unfortunately, you have to take it while you can. This is the only way that the Broncos will not be completely hamstrung and just overall screwed as a franchise for the next several years if they don't move on from Russell Wilson. So I'm curious, Broncos country, do you guys agree? Do you guys feel like the Broncos do need to move on from Russell Wilson this offseason? I've been back and forth on it pretty much all year, but now that the Broncos are basically eliminated from the playoffs, I do think it's going to happen. I don't think the Broncos are going to bench Russ or anything crazy like that. Jarrett Stidham, I will reiterate this based on what I've seen from him in training camp and the preseason, he cannot play at a high enough level to compete. He just can't. Vin DiNucci looked like the better quarterback throughout pretty much the entirety of the offseason up until maybe the last couple of weeks of the preseason. And even then, I felt like the only separation was because DiNucci started to fall off rather than Stidham started to rise. The only time Stidham looked good was against the Rams' fourth-string defense, who are a bunch of XFL players that aren't even on NFL practice squads right now. That's what those Rams fourth-stringers were. So Jarrett Stidham, I don't feel like is in the equation right now. Russell will finish out the final 2 games, but I do think those final 2 games are likely to be his final 2 in a Denver Broncos uniform. All right, Broncos country, be sure to leave a like on this video as well as subscribe and ring the bell so these videos appear in your notification feed. I would really appreciate it, guys. Those are 2 free and easy ways to show your support. Helps tell YouTube's algorithm to push us out and helps us get seen by more and more members of Broncos country just like you and me. And until next time, guys, happy holidays. I am your host, Gage Madrid, saying peace out.